For those of you that haven't met me, my name's Steve Fowler. I rejoined Ayzenberg this is my 6th week, I guess, back. I worked originally at Ayzenberg back in 2006 to 2013. My background is 24 years at working at video game publishers, other than the 6.5-year stint at Ayzenberg. Most recently, I left Fox Next, which was the video game division for Fox. I left there in March because there was a small little company called Disney that decided to spend $75 bazillion and buy them out. I'll talk a little bit about Fox Next, which I think is a pinnacle example of how video game publishers operate today. And I've got some case study information on that. Just before that, I was at Blizzard, where I ran the global publishing for the Hearthstone franchise, which is a pretty big trading card game, probably is the biggest digital trading card game in the world. And what you're looking at here is one of the proud achievements I had when I was back at Ayzenberg. I was responsible for the A-List brand, and eventually morphing the A-List brand into something called A-List Games. And the idea back then was, this is about 2010, 2011. This is really when our industry was radically changing. Digital distribution had become a significant platform to get games in front of gamers. No longer were the primary sources of getting interactive entertainment to people through retail channels. Now you could just download or install games on your phone or games on your PC through things like Steam, or even play games directly on Facebook back then. And what this did is it, I believe, really empowered game developers to believe that they could go out and strike off on their own. They were challenging the notion of what a traditional publisher brought to the table as far as value in a publisher-developer relationship. And many of these very talented folks went off on their own and started their own companies and maybe raised some money and started building games, thinking that they could just make a great game and people would find it and buy it and they'd be millionaires. Some of those people were successful, and mostly probably because early on, these digital platforms like the iPhone and Android or Steam had very few options. There were very small amounts of titles. And so if you had a pretty good game, people would find it and they'd tell their friends about it and you'd be off to the races. But not so much anymore. And even then, that was short-lived. And so my idea was, why don't we try to work directly with these folks and provide them services that they're missing? So to be somewhat a marketing extension, if you will, for these independent game developers that wanted to go direct to customers. But probably more important, and really the topic of this discussion, is how back then, 2010 or so, changed the way that all video game publishers operate now. And there were several things that digital distribution created. It created a direct communication with players. It created the ability to deliver ongoing content updates and to have the experience that you download and install today be very different than it was tomorrow and the weeks and months after then. And what that did is games were starting to be transitioned from products to services. We hear a lot about games as services. I haven't changed the slide yet, Max. I will. And the other things that were happening is people were experimenting with business models. And so things like free to play or subscriptions or microtransactions.
No.
Oh, what was that? Does somebody have a question? No. Okay. Let's go forward. So I was talking with a few of the folks here who are working with me on my new gig, Team Gold, which may turn into A-List Games. We'll find out, because I'm going to try to pitch that to Mr. Eric Ayzenberg on Wednesday and see if he still is digging that name. But for Team Gold, I was proposing that, at least for the core group of folks that they're working with me, Andrew Culp and EK and Ed Green and Keith Ewing and a few others, that I might share some of the experience that I had working at these different game publishers, and share with them where I thought these game publishers were really great and maybe where a few of them missed the mark. And I proposed a kind of a few working sessions here where we could do that. And Ed thought, hey, maybe this would be advantageous or beneficial to a greater audience, which is why he invited all you to join. So thank you very much. So this is just the first one. It's going to be a pretty high level overview of modern game publishing. It's going to focus mostly on publishers that are marketing and distributing games as services. It isn't one specific platform, although a lot of the examples I'll show you are based on mobile, because I believe mobile is where most of the innovation in game publishing and marketing is coming from. And it happens to be my last stop with Fox Next was 100% mobile focused. And then, of course, Hearthstone was both mobile and PC. But these are also truisms for console games as well, which we can talk about. I'm trying to leave about 15 minutes or so at the end if you have any questions. So I'll try to jump into this here. All right, I wanted to start and talk a little bit about what I was sharing with you earlier, because I found it was really interesting to try and do research around how other industries focused on and adapted to similar transitions. And back in 2010, I started to analyze what happened with movie, TV, and film industries, and specifically how the film industry, which had been very well established, tried to adapt in the 50s to television and the emergence of moving pictures in people's homes. And the things that I keyed on were the differences between the two platforms, which are similar to the differences that are going on, obviously, now with platforms in gaming, right? So in television, the content that's delivered is episodic. Usually it's a series, right? And then early on it was, okay, come back at Thursday at 8 o'clock to watch the next episode of so-and-so series. Or movies were self-contained, one sitting. Most of the content was delivered over the air for free on television. Nowadays, there's all sorts of digital distribution and streaming services that you pay lots of money for, and there's cable. But originally, it was seen as the business model was ad-supported through free distribution. And most of the television companies would do research before they put a whole lot of muscle or support, both through promotion, directly on their own channels, or outside of their own channels in paid advertising to promote a particular television series. And they would run pilot episodes, try to gather feedback. And there was a certain amount of research and data that went into trying to gather the likelihood of success of a particular television program. And thus they were really marketing services, right? They were trying to get someone to tune in at 8 o'clock on a Thursday, every Thursday, and give them reasons and reminders why they should come back every Thursday. They did this with much smaller budgets, and they iterated. They used a lot of alternative media sources. They didn't just rely on massive TV campaign commercials or big launch budgets. They were doing smaller, more targeted advertising to get people aware of and interested into a television program. And it allowed for them to create these pieces of content that were much more niche focused. They could go after smaller targeted groups, whether it was people that were interested in sci-fi or drama or comedies or something else, right? And this was different from film in these sorts of ways. And so I liken this a lot to the way console AAA games at retail had been operating, and still to a certain extent are operating, although it's changed a bit now. And for for film, the marketing teams would use these sorts of approaches to try to market film. They would mostly rely on push versus pull marketing. So they would be broadcasting out their message, telling folks when to show up and where to show up and why to show up, rather than having a dialogue necessarily with their customers. There was a very compressed life cycle for the marketing campaigns of films. They would try to blitz and saturate a market, share of voice-wise, for a very short amount of time to try to maximize their reach potential. They would invest tremendous amounts of money and time and effort into that one specific big budget asset, which is usually a trailer. They'd spend heavily on paid media. They were trying to maximize their total impression count. There's some other stuff they would use to try to feed other types of media outlets, whether those are one sheets or in theater advertising. But for the most part, it was a mass market impression based type of marketing effort. In television, though, it was more likened, I think, to where we are now mostly, which are games run as services. So I told you I worked at Fox Next. Our big hit game is Marvel Strike Force, which is a licensed Marvel mobile title. Actually, is the biggest Marvel mobile title. In television marketing, they flipped it on its head a little bit. So the research I was doing early on how the marketing teams and advertising agencies that were servicing ABC, NBC, CBS were working, they were more about pull versus push. So they would do on air or in between episodes promos for a particular series, and they would try to look at the similarities in viewership from one program to the next and run what they thought would appeal to a particular audience. So if somebody was watching Star Trek and there was a new sci-fi show, they would try to run those television ads just on those in between commercial pods for Star Trek. And they would do this over time. And it wasn't a mass market saturation. They were trying to go for targeting. They were targeted messages. And so they would preview these and tell you what was at the end of a particular episode, what was coming next week to try to get you to tune in and remember to come back next week. Very much like how games as services are trying to get you to log in every day and play, whether that's through, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, things that are in game like your daily rewards or your quests or those sorts of things. They'd spend less money and usually use more of their owned channels to do that. And they were trying really at the time, although they didn't use the word so much, to do retention-based marketing to get people to tune in every single week. They would look at ratings and analytics every single week. How well did we do or not do? And those decisions that would be made on subsequent content that went in the episodes or marketing that went to promote those episodes could change based on the ratings and analytics that they were looking at. So a lot of what research I was trying to analyze helped influence my kind of last 10 years in the games business. And I tried to borrow a lot from what I learned. And there's other case studies, if you're interested, I can share with you on what I think have really influenced the way we do games as a service marketing nowadays. And so I wanted to take you through a little case study of how this looks today. And so this was a analysis that we presented to some executives at Fox and Disney around how our publishing team at Fox Next actually works for Marvel Strike Force. And so what we're trying to show here is all of the different teams and all of the different stages of consumer that we're trying to move and make positive gains with. And so every kind of top left corner of this comic, it'll tell you what stage of a customer lifecycle we're considering, whether it's awareness, consideration, conversion, active players. And on the bottom left, we try to bring in here all the different teams that are responsible for bringing this all together. And I won't read this for you, you can read it yourself. But the important things to notice here is when this comes across to a user or a player, the important thing that we're trying to do is to have this all seem like it's coming from one voice, because a player has no idea that today they're being talked to by the community team and tomorrow they're being talked to by the live ops group, or right now I'm looking at an ad from the user acquisition team. None of that matters. To them, it's Marvel Strike Force talking to them. And it was important to us as the publishers and shepherds of that brand to try to grow that brand, that we're all talking from one voice. And so all of the decisions, all the way up from the top, from the president on down, around how we were organized, what tools we used at our disposal, we're always trying to make the game speak to our customers in the same tone of voice, with the same sort of cadence and messaging, whether you're playing it, whether you're on Facebook, interacting with it, whether you're on Reddit and you're talking to your buddies about it, it all should seem like it's one brand and one voice. And so let's flip to the next page here. As we go from top left, where a new player is exposed for the very first time on a Marvel-owned channel. So one of the things, obviously, that's great about having a licensed IP is we can tap into massive audiences that the brand itself has generated. So early on, we were using as much as we possibly could co-promotional efforts that Marvel would give us. So on their social channels, if we made a new piece of content in the game, in this case, we launched Captain Marvel in the game. This is right around the time when the Captain Marvel movie was coming out. And so they, on our behalf, placed a couple of social posts that gets us exposure to new audiences potentially. Those audience then kind of want to dig into it a little bit more, find out what it's all about. And so they might remember they've seen this social post later on and be exposed, or go search for it on their phone and go to our web store on the App Store for, let's say, iOS. And they might read a little bit of the content that's on there. We have videos and screenshots that can hopefully get them more interested. And maybe they're not yet ready to dive in and make the install. They need to be convinced more, and they leave. And maybe they come back later on that day or the next and are served up an ad. And that UA ad was well timed because we've tracked interest and used IDFA user data to target a particular user, retarget them with advertising that finally is the tipping point moment where they're like, yeah, let me give this a try. So they download and install and they play through the tutorial, they get offers. And as they're moving through the ecosystem, hopefully they're having fun, but maybe they have an issue and they go reach out to and find people in the community, whether that's on our social channels or more core engaged channels like Reddit or Discord. And our community managers are keen to that and see that there is a player that has problems and immediately to the customer service team, who can identify through username or IDFA, if possible, who that user is, and then deal with that from a customer service standpoint directly within the app, so we can message and directly communicate within the app with a single individual. Hopefully that solves their problem. They're having fun and they keep playing in the game. And eventually what we want to try to do is drive regularity of play. So the bottom left here is a really important KPI and measurement that at Fox Next was kind of the golden metric, if you will. We were always driving, and all systems were trying to move players into being regular, repeat players of the game. It's a very simple concept, but we would do analytics and business intelligence cohort analysis around who was somebody that we called a regular player, which simply meant that they logged in and played every day for the trailing 7 days in a row, and who was not a regular player. And all of the teams that you've seen here, whether that's my brand teams or the community teams or the customer service teams or the live ops or the design teams on the development team, are all oriented on trying to optimize towards players becoming regular within the game. And there's a really huge amount of research and study why that's important. And Fox Next did a really good job of sharing that internally. But suffice to say, if we can create regularity of play, most of the other important metrics will solve themselves. So lapsed users become easier to deal with. Monetization is not something that we're trying to force down their throats immediately. If we can create regularity, monetization will come. And so this, I think, is a great example of how publishers in 2020 are organized and are highly functional. In the old world of games as products, it was much more kind of that funnel on the left, where many times a game development team would have very little communication with their assigned marketing folks and would spend years building a product and eventually get to the point where, okay, within the next 12 to 8 months, we're going to ship this product. All right, let's get that product in front of the marketing team. And then the marketing team kind of takes the baton and creates all of the go-to-market strategy and then launches the product. And once they've launched that product, they kind of back off and then they turn it back over to the development team and move on to the next product. Where in a world of games as a services, all these different facets are intermingled with each other. So at Fox Next, for instance, that is demonstrated even from a physical co-location organization structure. So my community lead actually sat one cubicle away from the lead game designer. And my customer service lead for Marvel Strike Force literally sat next to the head of QA for Marvel Strike Force. And my lifecycle marketing team was fully embedded with all of the live ops team. And their day-to-days, 90% of the time, were in stand-up meetings with the developers, not with the marketing folks. And this was, I think, key to being able to move quickly and to be able to optimize and really run a more highly functional publishing team. And so I think there's three kind of pillars that go into this. One is understanding that we're talking about a holistic consumer journey, and that no longer are we just talking about go-to-market. We're talking about lots of facets of players, whether they're potential players, current players, or players that have left you, and all of the tools that we can bring to bear, whether those are marketing tools out of the game or tools within the game that can drive positive metrics in things like acquisition or awareness generation or consideration or converting people or keeping people active regular players or getting them to monetize or getting them to espouse the virtues of our game to others. And so that's one thing I'll go into more deep in the next slide. But the second one here is what I was talking about, which is the integration component. It's more about physical location. It was really at Fox Next, I think, a highly innovative approach that was a trickle down from the top, where the C-level folks and game team leads truly believed that they needed, respected, and appreciated all of the importance that marketing and publishing brought to the table, and knew that the game was only going to succeed some percentage less than it could if they didn't have those people invested and a part of every single decision that went into that game. And so our teams were at the table when it came to almost every discussion or decision that went into the product, as well as the marketing. So when game design decisions were being contemplated, or pricing decisions were being contemplated, or offers that went into the store itself, the appropriate team member from publishing was always there and just as valued as the game development team. There was a blurring of the lines of what was seen as traditional marketing and publishing disconnected groups. And finally, obviously, since 2010 or so, there's this explosion of marketing data that has been available. And teams nowadays have figured out, and I'll show you an example of this, how to parse through and find what's important in these buckets of data that exist now, because it can be very easily overwhelming to the process to look at all of these different KPIs and decide which ones are really important to pay attention, which ones can I not pay attention to, which of these should I be making decisions on, which of these data points do I need to look at more frequently or less frequently. And so there is a approach that I have used at the last couple of stops, which is the 6-bucketed approach, which you see here. And I think it's a really good indicator of how all of the different teams are interwoven with each other. But the probably most important part of this approach is understanding that we're talking to players in various states and trying to focus on the macro most important metric for each to understand where we're succeeding and where we're failing. So at any point in time in a game that's live, there are people that have never heard it, and we want to generate awareness up for them. There are people that have heard it and for whatever reason haven't yet decided to install the game, and we want obviously to convince them that they should install this game. There are people that are ready to install this game, and we need to give them that final push, that tipping point moment, and convert them and to drive an install. And then there are players that are actively playing your game, whether they're regular players or not, whether they're spenders or not. And there's different tools and levers we can use to motivate those activities. There are folks that are talking about our game, and both positively and negatively. And there are ways that we can encourage and amplify that. And this is not just influencers. This is anyone and everyone who's playing the game, because anyone and everyone now has their own social circles and their ability to influence others. And so how are we engaging with that activity, providing them content, incentivizing them to espouse how much love they have for the game, or vice versa, if they're not happy with the game, having discussion about it and having them understand that we're listening and that we care, that they care about the game. And then finally, there's people that for whatever reason leave, and how do we encourage them to come back? And so what we've done at FoxNext and even at Blizzard is we tried to turn these different buckets in the funnel into data-driven analyses that were looked at in a regular cadence, let's say daily or weekly. And we would build dashboards. And so this is a very, you don't have to read all this, but this is an example of what was done to support Marvel Strike Force from a dashboard perspective. So we went through and we analyzed Marvel Strike Force's business against these 6 categories. And we decided we needed to have dashboards that were on big display monitors all throughout the pens there at the office, and then on people's computers, obviously. And we tried to focus on the single top most important metric for each of those 6. So one metric we believed was the most important to monitor on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment, week-to-week basis to look at positive and negative trends. And so, for instance, for awareness, obviously we want to lift awareness. So the single most important metric that we believed that showed health on a moment-to-moment basis for awareness generation was total impressions we've generated and the share of voice versus a competitive set. And so there was a dashboard that would pull in all sorts of sources of impressions. So some of those down below, the supporting metrics, anywhere we could measure, whether that was through our UA spend or television advertising. We would try to aggregate all of the impression generation from social channels, from editorial coverage that we'd get, you name it. And there would be one dashboard that would consolidate all of that. And while the actual number itself, so today we generated 1.5 million impressions, that didn't really matter. What really mattered and what our team was trying to look at were fluctuations. And so if there's a big spike one day or a big dip one day, the intent of that dashboard was to have somebody ask the question why and go investigate the source of that. And so if there was a big giant spike of impressions and you found out, oh, those all came from a new article that we got on Polygon. Well, that was great. How did we generate that article? Did PR what's the sentiment on this article? Was it positive, neutral, negative? Do we want to do more of this? Do we think we can do more of this? And the same thing would go on for all of the other 6 here. So for consideration, we were, instead of looking at total macro aggregate impressions, we were looking for the quality impressions within there. And so we deemed that engagements. And so we sorted, rather than just total impressions, we were looking for an impression that had an action associated with it, a like, a share, a retweet, that sort of thing. And we were trying to look at fluctuations, again, daily or weekly, on how well we were driving this consideration, how well we were getting people that knew about us to take the next step and try to go to install the game. Conversion, this is where UA is mostly associated through targeted, data-driven paid media advertising. And so we're trying to spend money to gain installs of qualified players in the game. And by qualified, I mean players that will be ROI positive over the lifetime that they spend within our game. For active players, I mentioned this metric that was most important around regularity. So all of the analyses and metrics we were looking at would sort versus regularity. And so we would overweight our decision-making based on how well or not a particular action we were taking in marketing was driving people to become players in the last 7 days, and whether or not those players in the last 7 days have ever spent any money. There would be regular players and there would be regular customers, and we would make dashboards specifically for that. From an evangelist standpoint, Ayzenberg has a really cool tool, which I think isn't called the MVI anymore. It's called Social Index, I believe now, but we tried to use that to be a apples to apples comparison on how well we were generating earned media. And so we would look at referrals and shares that happened on mostly on our social channels or other channels where there was that sort of ability to do. And then lastly, lapsed. Lapsed is really interesting because lapsed is defined however you want it to be. So who do you deem as a lapsed player? Is it somebody who just fell out of regularity? Yes, for Fox Next, that was the most important thing that defined a lapsed player. That isn't always the case at every other publisher, but for us, when somebody dropped from being a regular player to not being a regular player, that would activate all sorts of systems. And so our lifecycle marketing team would take action here through the automated tools of communication that we had, whether those were in-app tools, whether those were push notifications on mobile devices, or simply email campaigns that we had. All right, I'm going to try to speed up now because I'm coming towards the end. So a well-rounded publishing team has all of these different divisions, if you will. There's product and brand marketing. There's UA teams. There's customer care and community, platform relations teams, lifecycle or CRM, and the people that are making the creative assets for all of those other teams that are kind of demanding of those assets. And so these folks have different specific jobs, but there's quite a bit of overlap with each other and with the development team. So generally, I found that product and brand marketing, which also now kind of wraps in a lot of the PR, because the facet of the profession of PR has radically changed too. That can be a whole nother discussion, and I will do another session where we dive deep into just the brand and product marketing section. But generally, these are the folks that are, I like to call Swiss Army knives within your marketing and publishing team. They can wear a lot of hats. They understand lots of facets around video game marketing, and maybe sometimes when there's a deficiency, they can step up and take more leadership role. But generally, they are the most close to the development team and to, if in our case with Marvel Strike Force, to the licensor. So they're usually the interface or liaison between, let's say, the development team and what the development team is making and the other teams in the product marketing group. So keeping up to speed and informing the creative teams and the UA teams and the lifecycle marketing teams what's coming down the pipe in the product. They oversee the PR and brand functionality and are usually the persons that you will, as the agency, interface with most. They're the ones that usually have all of the budget allocation outside of user acquisition, and sometimes in some cases even have the user acquisition budgets, and so they'll be your primary contact also. They're also important when it comes to launch. Even though I've downplayed the importance of launch versus how it used to be, it's still quite important, and especially in the digital world where launch now usually incorporates some sort of phased approach to release. And this is not just as mobile, it's also PC, and in some cases console, where the brand team is usually leading the rolling out of a particular product in a very methodical kind of test, optimize, cyclical nature by building a business case, coming up with the core positioning and assumptions of who target markets are, testing that in market in a small capacity. For mobile, this is usually done in a geo basis where you limit access to the app, let's say just to Canada, and test all of the things that you would normally want to do during the global launch, but in a much smaller scale, and then make interpretations of that data as if what would happen if we did go global from this. And then once you've got enough certainty that the metrics are showing indicators of success, then the brand team is the one that is executing against the global go-to-market strategy. User acquisition teams are now really sophisticated groups. And I have another deep dive session if you're interested in this, where I can show some of the techniques and processes that the Fox Next team had put in place, which I think is probably the most, well, first for certain is the most cutting edge UA team I have ever worked with, and probably one of the top 10 that there is in mobile marketing and mobile games right now. But generally, what we're doing is you're talking about ROI-driven performance UA spend that's done on digital platforms, and our most spending is happening on where the most advanced algorithmic-based programmatic platforms. And so, the big ones out there are going to be the Facebooks and Instagrams and Google with search and Apple even with search. But there are all sorts of ad networks and pre-install capabilities that in the next session, in the next couple of weeks, I can share with you. Important here is rapid, iterative A/B optimization and testing around creative. So, for instance, when we were putting together the sales deck to try to help sell Fox Next to Scopely, which ultimately happened, we did a kind of a count of all the marketing and UA assets that were created to market in the first 18 months, Marvel Strike Force. It had totaled over 19,000 individual unique creative assets that went into UA. And there's a very sophisticated process that was a weekly reoccurrence that had to be built to be able to create that pipeline between the creative asset development people, the people on the UA team that were testing those assets, and then the communication cycle of how well a particular asset did or did not do, and then back in taking that knowledge and iterating and changing creative assets to try to drive optimization and ROI on the spends. The team also would, in the UA side, rely heavily on automated platforms, software as a service. There's lots of decisions that can be made on what type of software as a service to use here. You can use third-party off-the-shelf software, campaign management software, DMP, MMP type software, or you can build your own. And there's some middle ground there that I can share with you, which is what Fox Next had done, is they've taken some amount of platform that had existed at one level and then added on features and functionality. But generally what you're trying to do is reduce time that your buyer, your UA media buyer, has to put into analyzing performance and automate as many of the decisions as possible in how to optimize subsequent spends or how to change creative that is in live in the field based on data. And so these things really can define success or failure in the market versus your competitive set on how well you're optimizing and how quickly you're optimizing in the UA space. Now, all of this, most of this now is being challenged, as you know, and this is a whole nother topic we can go into in the UA session, because of the privacy changes that are coming down the pipe. Obviously, Europe has already started this with GDPR. California has CCPA, and now Apple itself is threatening probably the most radical change by removing access to an individual level, what they call the IDFA, in information to power these ROI-driven UA changes. And massive changes in the industry are going to happen because of that. And I talked a little about the creative and the how we're aggressively trying to test as many different variants as possible. In customer care, one of the really cool things is that, at least for mobile, it's much more common to have CS actually be native in the app. And so whenever you have a problem or if there's a bug or a crash that happens, it's automatically connected to your device, and you can have immediate conversations with customer care as soon as you run into that. So really highly functional and important, because this is another really important tool in driving towards what we were talking about earlier, which is regularity. Community teams are, and community and customer care is a whole nother session too, which is kind of why I'm just brushing over it. But community has really changed over time. When I was running ArenaNet's publishing team, that was for the Guild Wars 2 MMO, community was really a closed network. Social media was still just kind of and most of the direct communication happened on owned forums. And nowadays, obviously, these new tools that are like Reddits and Discords, or even others that are emerging, are user-generated communications. And rather than the game team or the marketing team controlling the communication flow, it's the communities themselves that are controlling the communication flow. And that has big implications on how engagement happens, how information sharing happens, how tracking of sentiment happens amongst communities. And we can go deeper into that in the next session. Important for all of the different three platforms, mobile, PC, and console, is how well we are able to convince first-party folks to market on our behalf. And this was a huge focus at Fox Next. We had a team of about 5 people, and their entire jobs was to continually communicate with Apple and Google in this case, and others like Amazon, who ran a game distribution platform on Android, or Samsung, and to provide to them reasons why they should be featuring us, because you're talking about basically free advertising here. The same thing exists in trying to communicate with Valve and Steam, or Epic in the Epic Game Store, or Sony and Microsoft, because these dashboards that they control editorial on are critically important. And lastly, another session we can go over is retention marketing. Most people call this CRM or lifecycle marketing. In the case of Fox Next, this is primarily done through software. We used a tool called Braze, which was the CRM software that's built into the app. It allows for sophisticated automated communication based on player behavior. So for instance, if you have just finished beating a boss in a particular raid, and that unlocks the ability to move your Iron Man from 5 stars to 6 stars, we can send you a message directly within the app and tell you how to do that and why it's cool for your game. And that can be done in the app, as I just mentioned, or it can be done outside of the app. So if you belong to an alliance and your alliance just starts a new alliance war, we can send you a push notification to your device, even if you aren't playing the game, saying your alliance is behind, get in there and win the fight. Or old school, just sending emails and having those be automated by player behaviors. So if you're a new player, we've created a new player onboarding process through email based on you hitting level 10. That unlocks your ability to customize your superheroes. And so we'll send you an email explaining to you and giving you a little video with tips and tricks on how to customize your new Spider-Man that you unlocked. And finally, creative. At Fox Next, we had a 15-person internal creative development team that was mostly about 75% feeding the UA beast, so building out those 18,000 individual creative assets. And because the game was so beautiful, we spent a lot of our resources around gameplay capture and editorial. So we would have experts that could go into the Unity engine of the game and set up scenarios and do really cinematic captures and create video assets. Video being probably the most important piece of our UA ads. Also, these guys would make all of our social engagement assets. And that's it. So just to summarize, and then I'll open up for questions. That's kind of a high-level overview showing all the different components of modern publishers. And then for those of you that are interested in particular areas of publishers, I think Ed and I are going to look at, over the next couple of weeks, setting up deeper dives where we talk specifically about things like UA or lifecycle marketing or the like. So thanks.